Cuba has approximately 15 to 20 days of oil left. According to multiple verified reports, the estimate's not even speculative. It's a hard, imminent deadline shaping national governance, public services, transportation, food distribution, healthcare, refrigeration, and electricity supply. Fuel shortages at this scale do not merely slow an economy, they threaten the basic function of society. When strategic petroleum reserves dwindle to weeks rather than months, policy becomes crisis management rather than economic optimization. The United States has explicitly warned that any country attempting to supply Cuba with fuel or taking steps to prop up its energy system will face punitive tariffs or secondary sanctions. This dynamic transcends traditional sanction regimes and resembles a blockade in practice, revealing how modern geopolitical leverage is exercised through control of supply, finance, and punitive economic tools rather than overt warfare. The real world impacts are profound, right? Blackouts lasting like 15 hours a day, pharmacies unable to refrigerate insulin and other temperature sensitive medicines, flights grounded due to lack of jet fuel, and severe disruption of food logistics as refrigerated supply chains falter. So just imagine like your things are being carried in refrigerated trucks or whatever. Like they're not able to do that anymore, right? Families are reverting to cooking with firewood, not by choice, but due to necessity, creating additional health and environmental pressures. These cascading effects demonstrate how deeply interconnected modern systems are and how quickly one domain, such as energy, can compromise so many others. Cuba has they've always shown up for others before. In the wake of hurricanes, in Haiti, in Dominica, thousands of Cuban doctors and emergency personnel provided relief across the Caribbean, to be honest. History of Cuban solidarity versus reciprocal silence. There's loads of it. During the early stages of COVID, Cuban medical brigades were sent to Italy, Jamaica, and other countries where local health systems were overwhelmed. Cuban professionals have served in Angola, Ghana, Grenada, Trinidad, and across Latin America and Africa, offering not just medical care, but education, training, and long term capacity building. Those acts of international solidarity were not abstract gestures, they were material contributions that saved lives and strengthened community resilience. Yet now, when Cuba itself faces one of the harshest energy crises in modern history, that solidarity has largely gone unrepaid by the regional bloc that should have been first in line. Most CARICOM nations have issued only cautious or muted statements. Can you believe that? Like, there's literally been no bold regional energy bridge, no collective emergency summit, no coordinated fuel pool to cushion the shock. This silence is not just disappointing, it's strategically dangerous. If a small island like Cuba could take risks for others under sanctions and pressure, why do others hesitate when the crisis lands at their door? This is not merely about political rhetoric or diplomatic niceties. It's about the fundamental capacity of regional alliances to act when one of their own is in distress. The lack of a robust regional response underscores a structural weakness in Caribbean cooperation and a missed opportunity to demonstrate collective resilience in the face of global pressure. At the same time, external constraints are only part of the story, right? Cuba's crisis also exposes long-standing internal structural weaknesses. The Cuban economic model has remained highly centralized, with limited space for private enterprise, restricted access to foreign currency, and bureaucratic processes that slow adaptation and innovation. These conditions have hampered Cuba's ability to respond flexibly to shocks. Investment in energy infrastructure has been underfunded for absolutely decades. Even aging power plants and transmission networks ill prepared for acute fuel shortages. Governance structures prioritize political control over economic flexibility, making systematic adaptation slower than the pace at which external shocks are now occurring. These internal limitations, when compounded with external pressure, result in a crisis that is both in endogenous and exogenous, meaning, part of it's caused by outside forces like sanctions, but the rest that's coming from inside. Years of mismanagement, corruption, decisions made at the top that hurt the people at the bottom. In environmental terms, some critics have raised valid concerns about increased firewood use and related public health issues. However, in global context, Cuba's per capita carbon emissions remain for, I don't even think it's worth talking about. It's far below those of major industrialized nations, including the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, China. Cuba's limited industrial base and constrained consumption patterns have resulted in a comparatively small historical contribution to global emissions. The paradox that a low emission country now faces punitive economic pressure from high emission powers highlights structural inequities in how global climate and energy policies intersect with geopolitics. This asymmetry underscores a broader risk that access to clean technology and energy transition pathways is not evenly distributed, but instead of being controlled by economic and political power. Many analysts frame Cuba's predicament as a test of ideology, socialism versus capitalism, but this is false binary. The core issue is governance and adaptability, right? A state that restricts feedback, limits economic participation, and centralizes control inevitably reduces its capacity to respond to complex multi-vector shocks. Cuba's energy crisis reveals that rigidity, irrespective of ideological label, amplifies vulnerability. The crisis provides a practical lesson, right? Robust adaptation requires not only technical solutions, but political and economic space for diverse actors, community engagement, and iterative feedback mechanisms. If Cuba fails under these pressures, the dominant international narrative may conclude that low income, isolated economies cannot function independently. That narrative would ignore not only the role of external constraints, but the deeper internal governance challenges that have accumulated over decades. If Cuba survives, and here I'm going to be honest with you, survival means not just enduring blackouts, but emerging with a transformed infrastructure, the outcome must involve structural change rather than temporary coping. Successful transformation would require completely redesigning the energy system to reduce dependency on imported hydrocarbons, scaling renewable energy deployment, decentralizing energy governance, and integrating local innovation into national strategy. This is not speculative. Several countries demonstrate that high renewable energy penetration is viable. If you look at Spain, their grid has surpassed the 50% renewable electricity share. Denmark often generates the majority of its power from wind during high generation intervals. Iceland's electricity grid is nearly entirely hydro and geothermal. Brazil's electricity generation remains dominated by hydropower. These examples are not fringe experiments, they're full national systems. Renewable transition as opportunity. If Cuba transitions to a decentralized renewable energy model, solar arrays on rooftops, wind turbines suited to local conditions, community microgrids capable of islanded operation, when central supplies fail, and integrated battery storage at neighborhood scale, it could redefine what energy sovereignty really means outside the dominant global model. This transition requires political and economic recalibration. Cuba's existing model does not incentivize broad private sector participation or community entrepreneurship. Regulatory frameworks that enable small scale energy production, investment vehicles that channel diaspora capital into productive renewable projects, and transparent mechanisms for community governance would promote local empowerment without creating external dependency. For example, Cuba's diaspora remittances are a significant source of hard currency. Structuring investment vehicles that allow these remittances to fund renewable infrastructure would serve both economic growth and energy sovereignty. This is why I don't do long form. My battery just died. Where was I? Where was I? The broader global lesson is that dependency itself is a strategic risk. Countries heavily reliant on imported energy are vulnerable to price volatility, supply disruption, and geopolitical pressure. Cuba's crisis exemplifies this risk. This isn't just a Cuba thing. Look at the map. This kind of pressure is showing up everywhere. Let's run the comparisons, right? Nigeria, Haiti, Burkina Faso, Ghana, and even advanced economies like the United Kingdom face variants of this structural vulnerability, right? Centralized energy systems tied to global commodity markets expose nations to external leverage. Distributed local energy models reduce exposure and increase sovereignty, right? Africa presents an instructive parallel. Many African nations remain dependent on imported fuels and centralized grids, but part of the continent are also pioneering decentralized energy solutions. So if you think about the solar mini grids, pay-as-you-go systems, community cooperatives, and local battery storage, they're stabilizing the electricity access when national grids are struggling. In East Africa, towns disconnected from central grids are actually finding greater reliability through solar microgrids, offering a model for resilience outside of traditional energy paradigms. So if Cuba's forced transition succeeds, it actually could present a powerful case study to this emerging field, demonstrating that distributed, locally grounded energy systems can deliver resilience under acute external constraint. The wider Caribbean shares uh, analogous vulnerabilities, right? Island economies face unique exposure to climate variability, hurricanes, foreign energy price shocks, and a balance of payment strain. Tourism, a cornerstone of many Caribbean countries, collapses altogether when transport and energy systems fail. CARICOM nations are grappling with dependency on imported fuels, fragile infrastructure, and limited access to capital. A successful Cuban pivot towards decentralized energy could catalyze regional cooperation, shared microgrid standards, collaborative renewable technology procurement, cross-island grid planning, and collective bargaining in energy markets. This would not be mere solidarity, it's like a strategic resilience architecture, coordinated regional planning, shared technology platforms, and a pooled financing mechanism which could transform vulnerability into leverage. International blocs, such as BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, occasionally present themselves as alternatives to Western economic influence. If that reputation is to have any substance at all, it's moments like this, moments like the Cuban energy crisis, that are the tests of real influence. Let's keep it 100. What's required is not rhetorical support, but material assistance, technology transfer without exploitative strings, infrastructure investment that doesn't reproduce dependency in financial mechanisms that support sustainable development without tying Cuba to unsustainable debt. Experience shows that foreign assistance can sometimes create new dependencies if linked to extractive terms or opaque repayment conditions. True strategic partnership would involve collaborative design of energy frameworks that prioritize local ownership, skill transfer, and co-development of technology and maintenance capacity. Within Cuba, the governance dilemma is acute. Let's keep it 100, guys. A state that responds to crisis by further centralizing control over information, economic decision-making, and social space, risks amplifying rigidity and undermining adaptability. Whereas a state that embraces reform, loosening constraints on local enterprise, integrating community into innovation, international planning, and decentralizing energy governance, and fostering political space for constructive feedback, will increase both systematic robustness and political legitimacy. Cuba's energy crisis tests assumptions about resilience in the contemporary world. It demonstrates how dependency on imports, constrained markets, and external financial systems create leverage that can be used as a tool of policy pressure. It also shows that decentralized energy systems supported by local initiative and community engagement can, in fact, reduce that leverage and enhance agency. This is particularly salient in an era of climate instability, geopolitical realignment, and increasingly fractured global supply chains. If Cuba succeeds in building a renewable, decentralized, community integrated energy system, it will not merely recover from a temporary shortage, it will offer a new paradigm altogether. That energy sovereignty can actually be achieved through distributed solutions and local capacity building rather than reliance on external capital and centralized infrastructure. It will suggest that when the fuel tap is turned off, the smartest response is not to beg for it to be turned back on, but to build a system that does not break when the tap's off. That lesson, more than the shortage itself, explains exactly why Cuba's crisis matters far beyond borders. Not because Cuba is exceptional, but because it represents a set of vulnerabilities and opportunities facing nations worldwide. If Cuba succeeds, it will not just survive, it will rewrite assumptions about how nations adapt, thrive, and maintain sovereignty in a fractured global order. And that prospect is why policymakers, strategists, and economists should be watching this closely. Anyway, make sure you repost this. If you love my content, please subscribe. I've been chatting a lot today, haven't I? Anyway, love you all. And yeah, if you want to support my content, head over to my Patreon, click on there, and join my WhatsApp community. And thank you.